Welcome to the Thoughtful Leader podcast. My name is Ben Brearley. I'm a leadership coach and the founder of Thoughtful Leader. The Thoughtful Leader podcast is all about short, sharp leadership advice because thoughtful leadership is good leadership. Welcome to episode 296 of the Thoughtful Leader podcast. In this episode, I'm going to talk about a common challenge for thoughtful leaders, which is owning too much of other people's problems. So let's get into this episode right now. So the show notes page for this episode will be thoughtfulleader.com/podcast/296, where you can access all the links or anything else that I add here as resources from this episode. It's also where I put my links to leadership coaching as well. If you're interested in one-on-one coaching with me, please get in touch once again through that show notes page. Okay, let's get on with it. Now, if you have a tendency to take ownership of other people's problems, you're not the only one. Thoughtful people tend to think a lot, obviously, and they're often introspective and consider how their leadership impacts the people around them. And this is a good thing until we go too far with it. And when we do, we sometimes find ourselves taking ownership of other people's problems instead of just our part of the situation. So in this episode, I'm going to be looking at some situations when this is likely to occur and how you might be able to prevent it from happening. Now, firstly, you might ask, why do thoughtful leaders own other people's problems? Well, people are complex, so it's a bit of a tricky question, but in my opinion, this thoughtfulness has a big part to play. So people who are thoughtful often reflect on situations and consider how they respond and how they could have done better. Now, reflection is a great thing to do, but there are some caveats to reflection as well. So firstly, I believe that reflection is best when it results in some purposeful action or an increase in awareness. So for example, let's say that you had a bad interaction with a team member the other day. Now, if you reflect on the situation and you realize you could have approached it differently, then this is positive because you can try the new approach next time. So you might also reflect on the situation and realize that actually you did a pretty good job considering the circumstances. In this case, you feel reassured that you're on the right track and you have an awareness that you actually did pretty well. So that's also positive reflection. And by the way, a great tool to use for reflection on specific events like this is my useful thinking journal. You can try it out for yourself on the show notes page as well. Access the link there. But reflection can turn negative if we aren't careful. It can become a negative experience, all this introspection. So introspection is where you're thinking you're in your own head, and quieter leaders and introverts are often wired that way. I certainly am. So instead of acknowledging what we did well, we might actually find ourselves owning the situation. So for example, you might say, I could have done this instead. Why didn't I do that? I'm so stupid, right? You're very self-critical. And this is where we start to own other people's problems. It's when we consider that if we had just done something differently, things would have worked out okay. But the reality is often different because you can't control every situation. Reflection can be a negative experience when we continually find ways to point any issues back to ourselves and all the shortcomings we might have. So why do we do this? Well, it could be a lack of confidence or self-esteem, or perhaps negative messages that have plagued us since childhood. And whatever the case, we've got to be careful to set boundaries around what we will own and what we won't. And I recommend, if you haven't already, go back to episode 259 about why leaders should have a reflective practice. It's a good one. And once again, I really recommend reflection. So go check that episode out. So this sort of owning problems can be an issue for leaders in particular. Firstly, it results in additional mental stress. So we all have enough problems. Piling on other people's problems isn't going to help us. And second, it can cause feelings of helplessness and hopelessness, because imagine trying to fix problems that aren't really yours to fix or that you don't have much control over. It's likely that doing this will result in feeling quite useless and disempowered. And lastly, taking on other people's problems reduces the other person's accountability. If you're there to pick up the pieces and solve everything, there's really no need for them to try. And over time, this can result in team members simply waiting for you to try to fix problems while they sit back and watch. And for these team members, it might feel like a positive thing when you're running around trying to help them because they don't need to do anything. But actually, this is disempowering for them too. They won't grow or improve if they fail to take accountability for their own part in workplace problems. And there's a related article I'd recommend you check out about team members who won't take accountability. Check that out in the show notes page as well. So let's look at a few situations now where I find thoughtful leaders in particular tend to take ownership of other people's issues. And these are often situations where we try to fix or change things that aren't appropriate, or where we try to control more than just our part of the situation. Now, the first one is when it comes to poor performance. So sometimes leaders run into trouble when they take accountability for the performance of others. So here's what this might look like. The leader might provide support to help the team member improve through methods like training or coaching. And they spend considerable time hand-holding and fixing any issues with the work because they don't want problems to come back and bite them. And yes, leaders are accountable for their teams, but they aren't accountable for individual performance. So in the same way that a CEO will expect certain outcomes from her CFO, your team members must take ownership of their own work too. If you believe otherwise, then you'll constantly be the one who has to clean up everything in your team. The second situation I see is when it comes to workload. Now, an analogy that is often used in workplaces is that of monkeys representing work. So if you've got lots of monkeys on your back, then you have a lot of work to do. So other people sometimes try to give you their monkeys. People who are especially helpful are usually the prime targets for offloading monkeys. And sometimes people also take extra monkeys on because nobody else will. They know something bad will happen if nobody does the work, so they accept it instead. So if you're taking on more monkeys than you can handle, there's a good chance you are owning other people's problems. And there's a related article I'd suggest you check out as well. If you're too busy at work, try these 5 things. Check that out in the show notes page as well. That was thoughtfulleader.com/podcast/296. Another situation I see thoughtful leaders owning other people's problems is when it comes to difficult conversations. Because having a conversation about performance or behavior is quite hard, and it's even harder if you start to own the entire interaction. Now, one thing I've noticed is that some thoughtful leaders start to become fearful of the other person's reaction to the conversation. So, for example, they may avoid a discussion because they're worried about how it would be perceived or that it might upset somebody. Now, this is quite natural and normal, but it can really hold us back because we can't control what the other person does. Now, think about the parts of a difficult conversation that you do own. Well, firstly, you own the manner in which you approach the situation. You own the words that you say, including any feedback. And you own acknowledging the way that you may have contributed to the situation. Now, other than that, we can do very little to control the response of the other person or whether they change their behavior afterwards. So you can see that there's a bunch of things there that we are responsible for, but it's all about how we engage. It's not about their reaction because we can't really control that. So the last situation where I see this happen a lot is when it comes to motivating others. And I think there's a misconception about motivation that it's up to the leader to motivate the team. Now, while of course the leader has a part to play in shaping the team environment, there are 2 sides to motivation. When leaders start owning other people's motivation, they tend to start jumping at solutions. They keep trying different approaches and become frustrated if the person's commitment fails to improve. Now, I've written a bunch of articles about motivation, and I'll link to a couple of them in the show notes page. So I won't go into specific details here, but the leader plays their part by trying to find out what makes people tick and then attempting to provide some of that in the workplace. But then it's up to the team member to try things, become aware of their own motivation levels, to take care of themselves outside of work and to make adjustments if they aren't getting what they need. So it's not all on the leader. The leader creates the environment and then the team member has to step up. They have to play a part in their own motivation as well. So the crux of this is, okay, what do we do about this? If we tend to own other people's problems, what can we do? Well, it's time to make a change here. Because continuing with things the way they are is a recipe for more of the same, including potential burnout or feelings of helplessness. The first thing I'd recommend is to stop and consider your boundaries. Now, clarifying your boundaries is an important step, preventing you from taking on too much of what other people should be owning. So the boundaries I'm referring to here relate to where your responsibility ends and the other person's begins. So here's a few examples. So in a difficult conversation, you own the manner that you approach it and the words that you say. The other person owns their reaction and their response. Now, when it comes to poor performance, you own the feedback, support, and coaching that you provide. The other person owns the improvement in their performance over time and the effort that they put in. Now, when it comes to motivation, you own understanding what drives your people and creating the conditions to help that happen. They own bringing the energy and commitment and telling you what's working for them and what's not. Now, when it comes to workload, you own the tasks within your role and responsibility, and other people own theirs. So it's worth stopping sometimes to map out where your accountability starts and ends, depending on the situation. And if you go back to episode 104 of this podcast, which is about why leaders must set boundaries at work, that one can be helpful as well. So check that one out. And while I'm at it, if you enjoy this podcast, I'd love you to pause it right now and give me a 5-star review on your podcast app of choice. It helps me to get the word out to other thoughtful leaders just like you and get the help they need as well. So the second thing I'd recommend here after setting boundaries is deciding what you need other people to do. So following on from your boundaries, you need to get clear about what you need other people to own. And then the next step is to provide that feedback to them. There is no use wishing for people to change or to take accountability. It's possible they don't even know that there's an issue. So the first step is to communicate the parts of the situation that you will own and the parts that you won't. And thirdly, you have to find the consequences. And I spoke about this in the last episode actually, but an element that is worth mentioning is that of consequences. Too often, when thoughtful leaders take on other people's problems, it's because they're seeing the other person failing to take ownership. So what do? Well, they step in and they fill the gap. And usually I find that the lack of accountability is linked to a lack of consequences. So if your team member performs badly, what happens? Do they get a warning? Are they going to get fired? Or does nothing really happen other than some talking? So in other words, why would the person bother to take ownership of their part? So consider whether there really are any consequences in your situation. Now, if your answer is no, then you need to work on finding some. And you can go back to episode 227 as well, which is a good one. Want your people to change? Ask this leadership question. And that question, a bit of a spoiler alert, why would the person bother to change their behavior is that question. So check that episode out, especially if you're dealing with some people challenges or performance issues or behavior problems, all those sorts of things. You really need to dig into what the consequences are here. So taking on other people's problems will generally make you less effective because you'll have less headspace to focus on your own priorities. You'll feel ineffective because you'll be unable to make the change and impact that you'd like to. So be intentional about where your responsibility begins and ends, and you'll stop enabling others to avoid their own accountability. And I'd love to get your thoughts on this. What do you think is required to stop owning other people's problems? Do you find yourself falling into this trap? I'd love to get your thoughts on this. So you can do that at the show notes page, thoughtleader.com/podcast/296. I really appreciate your point of view on this one. All right. Thank you very much for listening. It is always appreciated. And I'll be back next week.